Good evening, friends, and welcome to Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the stories of remarkable lives. Before we begin tonight's journey, if you like to watch these stories, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below telling us which historical figure you'd like us to explore next. Tonight, we travel to a moment that changed everything. It's May 1796, and a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte has just entered Milan. He's 26 years old, largely unknown, commanding an army that arrived in Italy, starving and barefoot. The soldiers haven't been paid in months. The government in Paris has no money to send them. By all logic, this campaign should collapse within weeks. But something remarkable happens instead. Within days of occupying Milan, gold begins flowing, not from Paris, but from the conquered territories themselves. The Duke of Parma surrenders 2 million francs to avoid destruction. Venetian treasuries open their vaults. Artwork worth fortunes moves north toward France. And for the first time in years, French soldiers receive wages, paid in actual gold coins, not worthless paper. Napoleon has stumbled onto a secret that will carry him from obscurity to empire. He has discovered that if you move fast enough, strike hard enough, and demand systematically enough, war doesn't have to drain a nation's coffers. War can fill them. For the next 20 years, Napoleon will turn this insight into the most efficient extraction machine Europe has ever seen. He will pull hundreds of millions in tribute from conquered lands. He will strip palaces, empty treasuries, and redirect the wealth of nations into French coffers. He will build an empire funded almost entirely by the people he conquers. Until, one frozen winter in Russia, the entire system collapses. This is the bedtime biography of Napoleon Bonaparte. Chapter 1. The Island Boy, August 15, 1769. In a modest house on the Rue Saint-Charles in Ajaccio, Corsica, a woman named Letizia Ramolino Bonaparte goes into labor. The story would later be told that she barely made it home from Mass, that the child arrived so quickly she gave birth on a sofa in the downstairs salon. Whether true or embellished, the detail fits. Napoleon Bonaparte entered the world in a hurry, as if impatient even then. The timing of his birth mattered more than anyone could have known. Just 15 months earlier, Corsica had ceased to be Genoese and become French. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in May 1768, transferred the mountainous island to King Louis XV. The Corsican people, who had briefly tasted independence under the leadership of Pasquale Paoli, fought the occupation. French troops crushed the resistance at Ponte Novo in May 1769, just 3 months before Napoleon's birth. Among Paoli's defeated partisans was Napoleon's own father, Carlo. Carlo Bonaparte was 23, a lawyer by training, an opportunist by necessity. When Paoli fled to England and the cause collapsed, Carlo made a calculation that would shape his son's future. He submitted to French rule. More than that, he embraced it. The powdered wigs came out, the embroidered waistcoats, the silver-buckled shoes. Carlo cultivated the new French governor, Charles-Louis de Marbeuf, with such success that Marbeuf became godfather to one of Carlo's children and patron to the entire family. This pragmatic shift brought consequences. In September 1771, the Bonaparte family's noble status was officially recognized by the French, a recognition that would later allow Napoleon to attend military school in France. 4 degrees of nobility were required for admission. The Bonapartes, descended from minor Tuscan nobility who had emigrated to Corsica in the 16th century, could claim them. Barely. But nobility did not mean wealth. Letizia and Carlo lived in a state of perpetual financial anxiety, raising 8 surviving children, Joseph, Napoleon, Lucien, Elisa, Louis, Pauline, Caroline, and Jerome, through very difficult times. 5 more had been stillborn or died in infancy. The house on Rue Saint-Charles was respectable but modest. There was always too little money and too many mouths to feed. Letizia ruled the household with firm discipline. She had married Carlo at 14 and would outlive him by 51 years, dying at 86, having witnessed her second son's rise to emperor and fall to exile. Later, from the palace of the Tuileries and then from distant St. Helena, Napoleon would say of her, "The future destiny of the child is always the work of the mother." She had restrained a rambunctious, combative boy who loved fighting as much as studying. She had taught him that survival required strength. The Corsica of Napoleon's childhood was a world unto itself, mountainous, isolated, poor. Roads were primitive, rail construction non-existent, politics centered on familial loyalty and patronage. Vendettas could span generations. The landscape was rugged, beautiful, and unforgiving. The people were proud, suspicious of outsiders, fiercely independent in temperament, if no longer in fact. Young Napoleon absorbed all of this. He learned Italian before French. His first words were in the language of his ancestors, not his new rulers. He learned that power belonged to those who could seize it, that loyalty could be purchased or commanded, that yesterday's enemies could become today's patrons if circumstances demanded. He learned, watching his father, that principles were luxuries the poor could not afford. In January 1779, when Napoleon was 9 years old, Carlo's cultivation of French favor bore fruit. Napoleon and his older brother Joseph were enrolled at the French College d'Autun to improve their French. Napoleon would spend only 3 months there before being sent on to the military college at Brienne. On a cold December day, Carlo, Joseph, Napoleon, and their uncle Joseph Fesch set sail from Bastia for the French mainland. Napoleon would not return to Corsica to live for 8 years. When he finally came back in September 1786, he was no longer quite the island boy who had left. He spoke French now, though with an accent that would mark him forever. He had spent 5 years at Brienne, learning mathematics, geography, history, and military science. He had been mocked by wealthier students for his accent, for his poverty, for his provincial origins. He had been lonely, isolated, a Corsican among Frenchmen who saw Corsicans as barely civilized. But he had also been hungry for knowledge, for distinction, for a future that did not involve the grinding poverty of his childhood. His instructors noted his aptitude for mathematics. They noted, too, his fierce temper, his pride, his unwillingness to back down from confrontation. One described him as reserved and hard-working, another egotistical, a third extremely ambitious. All of them were right. The seeds planted in Corsican soil, the poverty, the pragmatism, the understanding that power flowed to those bold enough to grasp it, would grow in French military schools into something the world had never quite seen before. The boy who left Corsica in 1779 carried with him a hunger that would never be satisfied, a hunger for wealth to replace the poverty he'd known, a hunger for glory to erase the mockery he'd endured, a hunger for power to ensure he would never again be at the mercy of circumstances or men. 20 years later, that hunger would drain the treasuries of Europe. Chapter 2. The Education of Ambition. The military college at Brienne sat in the Champagne region of northeastern France, a cluster of stone buildings where the sons of impoverished nobility learned the profession of arms. Napoleon arrived in May 1779, 10 years old, speaking French poorly, wearing clothes that marked him as provincial. The other boys, Many from wealthy families noticed immediately. They mocked his accent. They mocked his Corsican origins. They called the island backward, uncivilized, barely French at all. Napoleon responded not with accommodation, but with fury. He fought back, sometimes with fists, more often with a cutting intelligence that could slice through pretension with surgical precision. He became known as a loner, difficult, proud beyond his station, but he also became known as brilliant. Mathematics came to him effortlessly, numbers, calculations, geometric problems that baffled other students. He devoured books on geography, studying maps, until he could recall terrain features from memory. He read military history obsessively, Caesar, Alexander, Frederick the Great. He read philosophy, particularly Rousseau, whose ideas about natural man and corrupted civilization resonated with a Corsican boy who felt himself an outsider in French society. His teachers produced reports that captured the contradiction. Reserved and hard-working, wrote one. Egotistical, noted another. A third observed, extremely ambitious. None of them quite knew what to make of this small, intense student who excelled at mathematics and brooded over maps. Napoleon spent 5 years at Brienne, from 1779 to 1784. 5 years of isolation, punctuated by long letters home about Corsican politics and passionate defenses of Pasquale Paoli, the resistance leader his father had abandoned. The boy who had left Corsica was becoming something neither quite Corsican nor quite French, a hybrid, adaptable, belonging fully to neither world. In September 1784, Napoleon gained admission to the École Militaire in Paris, the most prestigious military academy in France. This should have been a triumph. It was also a crisis. The course normally took 2 years. Napoleon's family could barely afford one. Then, in February 1785, his father died of stomach cancer, leaving the family in desperate financial straits. Napoleon was 16 years old. Though Joseph was the eldest son, Napoleon assumed the role of family head with characteristic force. He compressed the 2-year artillery course into a single year of intensive study, driving himself with almost manic energy. In September 1785, he was examined by the renowned scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace and graduated 42nd in a class of 58. Not brilliant by the school's standards, but sufficient. More importantly, he became the first Corsican to graduate from the École Militaire. He received his commission as a second lieutenant in the La Fère Artillery Regiment. He was 16 years old and had a profession. He also had a salary, though a modest one, and with it the ability to send money home to his mother and siblings. The years between 1785 and 1793 were years of ferment. Napoleon served in garrisons at Valence and Auxonne, but he spent long periods on leave in Corsica, watching as revolution consumed France and wondering where his own loyalties lay. When the Bastille fell in July 1789, Napoleon was in Corsica. He embraced revolutionary ideals, liberty, equality, careers open to talent rather than birth. But his deeper attachment remained to Corsica itself. In 1791, he was elected lieutenant colonel in the Corsican National Guard, a position that put him in Paoli's orbit once again. The aging resistance leader had returned from English exile, and Napoleon, now 22, hoped to work alongside his childhood hero. But Paoli and Napoleon clashed almost immediately. Paoli saw in Napoleon someone too French, too ambitious, too willing to serve the republic that had conquered Corsica. When Napoleon asked for documents to help write a history of Corsica, Paoli snapped, "History cannot be written by young men." The breach widened. In 1793, as France descended into the terror and civil war erupted in Corsica, Paoli turned against the Bonapartes entirely. The family that had once fought for independence, then accommodated French rule, was now condemned by Corsican nationalists as traitors. On May 23, 1793, a mob sacked the Bonaparte house in Ajaccio. The family fled, arriving in France in June with little more than the clothes they carried. Napoleon, now 23, had lost his homeland. The island he had loved, the identity he had clung to through mockery and isolation, was closed to him. But he had also been freed from divided loyalties. He rejoined his regiment at Nice as Napoleon Bonaparte. The family had Gallicized their name, and threw his support fully behind the Jacobins, the radical faction that had seized control of the revolution. In September 1793, opportunity arrived. The port city of Toulon had been seized by royalist forces who invited in the British Navy. The Republican government needed to retake it. Napoleon, through the influence of a Corsican deputy named Antoine Salicetti, was appointed commander of artillery for the siege. At Toulon, Napoleon showed what he had learned in all those years studying maps and mathematics. He proposed a plan: capture the fort dominating the harbor, position artillery there, and force the British ships to evacuate. The plan worked brilliantly. On December 17th, the British withdrew. Toulon fell. Napoleon was 24 years old. On December 22nd, he was promoted to brigadier general. He had also received his first bayonet wound and his first taste of reward for military success. Victory brought promotion, recognition, and access to power. The education was complete. Now the real work could begin. Chapter 3. The Italian Revelation. On March 27, 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte arrived at Nice to assume command of the Army of Italy. He was 26 years old, recently married to Josephine de Beauharnais, and facing a command that would have broken most generals before the first battle. The Army of Italy existed mostly on paper. Its official strength was listed at 42,000 men. Its actual fighting strength was perhaps 30,000. The soldiers were starving. Many had no shoes. Their uniforms hung in tatters. They had not been paid in months, some not in over a year. Desertions were constant. Morale had collapsed entirely. The three divisional commanders, Jean Serrurier, Pierre Augereau, and André Masséna, regarded their new commander with barely concealed contempt. A political general, they assumed, someone who had earned his rank by firing cannons at Parisian mobs, not by winning battles. Napoleon was younger than all of them, inexperienced in commanding large forces, and rumored to have gained this post through his wife's connections to Directory member Paul Barras. Napoleon called them together and began discussing his campaign plan. Within minutes, their smirking stopped. He spoke with precision about the terrain, about Austrian and Piedmontese dispositions, about exactly where and how he would strike. He had studied the maps obsessively during his journey south. He knew every pass, every river crossing, every defensible position. More importantly, he knew something the Directory itself had only half acknowledged in his orders. The Army of Italy was not expected to win glory. It was expected to feed itself. France's treasury was empty. The Directory could send neither money nor supplies. But Italy, wealthy, divided, defenseless Italy, could provide both. Napoleon's secret instructions were clear. Exact contributions from conquered territories. Seize what you need. Make war pay for war. On April 10th, Napoleon addressed his troops. His proclamation would become famous. "Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much. It can give you nothing. Your patience, the courage you display in the midst of these rocks are admirable. But they procure you no glory. I seek to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches. It was a promise. It was also a threat, and it worked. Within days, Napoleon's army descended from the Alps into Piedmont like a thunderbolt. At Montenotte, Dego, and Mondovi, they shattered the Austrians and Piedmontese. On April 28th, the Armistice of Cherasco was signed. The King of Sardinia agreed to withdraw from the war and pay substantial contributions. The flood had begun. On May 9th, Napoleon signed an armistice with the Duke of Parma, who surrendered 2 million livres, 1,700 horses, and 20 paintings to be selected by French commissioners. On May 10th, Napoleon led his army across the bridge at Lodi under withering Austrian fire. It was more theatrical than strategic, but his soldiers began calling him the Little Corporal, a term of rough affection from men who had watched him share their dangers. 5 days later, Napoleon entered Milan in triumph. The plundering began immediately. Chapter 4. The System Refined. Milan fell to Napoleon on May 15, 1796, and with it came the revelation that would define his career. The city's treasuries, its palaces, its churches, all held wealth beyond anything his ragged soldiers had imagined. Within days, French troops were collecting tribute systematically. Despite Napoleon's public pronouncements about identifying with Italian nationalism, the reality was brutally simple. Looting, plundering, and taxation provided his soldiers with approximately half their back pay. But Napoleon understood something crucial that separated him from common pillagers. Random theft created chaos and resentment. Systematic extraction, formalized through treaties and armistices, created revenue streams. On May 11th, just 4 days after occupying Milan, Napoleon wrote to the Directory requesting the creation of a commission specifically charged with selecting artworks from Italian museums to be sent to Paris. The commission was established quickly. Art experts accompanied the army, cataloging treasures with the efficiency of tax collectors. Jean-Baptiste Wicquart led the early selections, choosing paintings and sculptures with professional discernment. This was not mere looting. It was organized cultural appropriation on an industrial scale. The pattern repeated across northern Italy through the summer of 1796. Each city that fell, each duchy that sued for peace, paid tribute formalized in official documents. On June 21st, Napoleon wrote to the Directory announcing a fresh dispatch of paintings, particularly works by Raphael. 2 weeks later, he reported another shipment, silverware, jewelry, and liquid assets converted directly into francs. The siege of Mantua began in June and would last 8 months. But Napoleon did not wait idle. He invaded the Papal States, officially in revenge for the 1793 murder of a French diplomat, but motivated equally by revolutionary hatred for the papacy and the lure of papal wealth. On June 23, 1796, Napoleon reached Bologna and expelled the papal authorities. Pope Pius VI, understanding the futility of resistance, sued for peace immediately. The Armistice of Bologna was signed that same day. Its terms were crushing. The Pope agreed to pay a large indemnity and surrender Bologna and Ferrara to French occupation. But Napoleon had larger ambitions. The treaty was never ratified in Paris because Napoleon already planned to return and extract more. He did. In February 1797, Napoleon invaded the Papal States again. This time, he dictated the Treaty of Tolentino, which stands as perhaps the purest expression of Napoleon's extraction system. Pope Pius VI agreed to surrender 100 art treasures from the Vatican, to be selected by French commissioners and shipped immediately to France. The list included the Apollo Belvedere, the Laocoon group, and Raphael's last painting, the Transfiguration. Additionally, the Pope would provide 500 manuscripts and pay 30 million francs in war indemnities. 30 million francs, 100 irreplaceable artworks, 500 ancient manuscripts, all formalized in a treaty, all made to appear as legitimate terms of peace rather than extortion at gunpoint. The Duke of Modena received similar treatment. His armistice, signed in May 1796, demanded 20 paintings from the Este collection and a monetary sum triple what Parma had paid. When French commissioners entered Modena in October, they took not just paintings, but 1,213 items from the ducal collections, 900 bronze Roman coins, ancient medals, Greek coins, engraved precious stones, and manuscripts from the ducal library. Bologna lost 31 paintings, 115 prints, and 546 manuscripts. The Republic of Venice, forced to sign a treaty in May 1797, surrendered 20 paintings and 500 manuscripts. Additionally, though not mentioned in the treaty, French forces carried away the 4 bronze horses from St. Mark's Cathedral and the lion from St. Mark's Square. Milan, Verona, Perugia, Loreto, Pavia, Cento, Cremona, Pesaro, Fano, and Massa each rendered its artistic tribute to Napoleon. The wealth flowed north in an endless stream. Paintings by Titian, Veronese, Correggio, and Mantegna, sculptures from antiquity, manuscripts illuminated by medieval monks, all of it systematically catalogued, crated, and shipped to Paris. Napoleon's correspondence from this period reveals his meticulous attention to the financial machinery of conquest. He sent detailed instructions on extraction methods. He demanded regular accountings. He personally reviewed lists of artworks selected for seizure. While his generals focused on tactics and maneuvers, Napoleon tracked the Franks and the paintings with equal intensity. By late 1796, the Directory in Paris had received millions in gold and silver from Italy. The French armies on the struggling Rhine front received financial support from Napoleon's conquests. The Army of Italy, once the poorest and most neglected force in the French military, now paid itself while enriching the government. In October 1797, Austria signed the Treaty of Campo Formio, formally ending the War of the First Coalition. Austria ceded the Austrian Netherlands and recognized French control over most of northern Italy. More importantly, Austria acknowledged in writing France's right to the artistic treasures already taken. Napoleon returned to Paris a conquering hero. He was 28 years old. He had proven that armies need not drain national coffers. They could fill them. The Italian laboratory had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Now, Napoleon wondered, if this worked in Italy, where else might it work? His eyes turned toward Egypt. Chapter 5. Egyptian Gamble. By early 1798, Napoleon faced a strategic puzzle. The War of the First Coalition had ended, but Britain remained undefeated, dominant at sea, and increasingly dangerous. Direct invasion of Britain was impossible. The Royal Navy controlled the Channel absolutely. Napoleon needed another approach, and he proposed one to the Directory: strike at Britain's empire by establishing a French colony in Egypt. The plan had strategic merit. Egypt's location could threaten British trade routes to India. French control there might even enable a future expedition against British possessions in the East. But Napoleon's proposal also had an unspoken economic dimension. The Directory's coffers, briefly filled by Italian plunder, were emptying again. Egypt's rumored wealth, ancient treasures, trade riches, offered another tributary to tap. The expedition gathered in Toulon through April and May 1798. 13 ships of the line, 13 frigates, and over 200 transports assembled to ferry the Armée d'Orient to Egypt. The fleet carried approximately 36,000 troops, plus 167 scientists, artists, and scholars. The Commission des Sciences et des Arts intended to study Egyptian civilization and provide propaganda value to what was fundamentally a military conquest. Neither soldier nor savant knew their destination. Secrecy was essential given British naval superiority. The Directory authorized Napoleon to take 1.5 million francs from the treasury, plus 3 million from the Bernese treasury, money France had extracted from Switzerland after creating the Helvetic Republic. Initial funding totaled perhaps 8 to 9 million francs. Monthly army payroll alone approached 1 million francs. The numbers did not balance. Napoleon needed Egypt to pay for itself quickly, just as Italy had. But first, a detour. On June 10, 1798, the French fleet arrived at Malta, then controlled by the Knights of St. John. Napoleon ordered an invasion on the pretext that Malta had shown hostility by refusing anchorage to his entire fleet. The Knights, half of whom were French and refused to fight their countrymen, surrendered after minimal resistance. Malta's treasury yielded spectacularly: 5 million francs in gold, 1 million in silver, 1 million in gemstones, plus gold plate and jewelry plundered from the Knights' private residences, perhaps several million more in total. Over 7 million francs in portable wealth, all loaded aboard Napoleon's flagship L'Orient, the 120-gun warship that would carry him to Egypt. The fleet reached Alexandria on July 1, 1798. Napoleon landed his army and immediately faced the miscalculation that would doom the expedition financially. When the French disembarked at Alexandria, they carried between 1 and 4 million francs in cash. Monthly expenses, salaries, supplies, transport, equipment, required close to 1 million francs. The arithmetic was brutal. Napoleon needed Egyptian wealth to materialize immediately. It did not exist, not in accessible form. The French had expected treasuries, hoards, concentrated wealth like they had found in Italian duchies. Instead, they found a poor country under Ottoman misrule, its wealth dispersed or already looted by centuries of occupiers. The local Egyptians had enjoyed a millennium head start in treasure hunting their own ancient sites. On July 21st, Napoleon won the Battle of the Pyramids and marched into Cairo, a military triumph, but the treasuries remained empty. The soldiers went unpaid, food supplies dwindled, disease spread through the ranks. The Egyptian campaign, conceived as self-financing conquest, was consuming resources with no compensating plunder. Then came the catastrophe. On August 1, 1798, British Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Abu Qir Bay. In the Battle of the Nile, L'Orient caught fire and exploded spectacularly. Napoleon's flagship, carrying the Maltese millions, gold, silver, gemstones, all of it, went to the bottom of the Mediterranean. Witnesses reported the battle stopping as flying debris and red-hot gold rained down on the ships. Napoleon's army was now trapped in Egypt, unpaid, hungry, cut off from France. The Maltese treasure was gone. Egyptian wealth had proven illusory. In October 1798, Cairo erupted in revolt against French occupation. Napoleon suppressed it brutally, but the expedition was clearly failing on every level: military, political, and especially financial. In March 1799, Napoleon invaded Ottoman Syria, hoping to salvage something from the disaster. The siege of Acre ended in failure. By August, Napoleon made his decision. He abandoned his army, still unpaid, still stranded, and sailed secretly back to France. Egypt had taught him a harsh lesson. You cannot extract wealth from treasuries that do not exist. Chapter 6. The Consulate's Cash Machine. Napoleon landed at Fréjus on October 9, 1799, abandoning his army but escaping the Egyptian disaster with his reputation somehow intact. Parisian newspapers, fed carefully curated dispatches, had reported his victories while downplaying his defeats. France knew of the pyramids, not the plague. They knew of Cairo's fall, not the army's starvation. Napoleon arrived home, still carrying the aura of the Italian triumph, and he arrived to a France on the brink of collapse. The Directory government was paralyzed by corruption and infighting. French armies on the Rhine were retreating. The treasury was bankrupt. Inflation ravaged the economy. Royalist and Jacobin factions both plotted coups. France, exhausted by a decade of revolution and war, desperately wanted stability. It wanted someone strong enough to impose order. Napoleon moved with characteristic speed. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, he staged a coup d'etat. The Directory was dissolved. A new government, the consulate, was established with 3 consuls nominally sharing power. In reality, Napoleon, as First Consul, held supreme authority. He moved immediately into the Tuileries Palace, the former royal residence near the Louvre. He was 30 years old and controlled France, but he controlled a France that was bankrupt. The revolution had destroyed the old tax system without creating an effective replacement. The assignats, revolutionary paper currency, had collapsed into worthlessness through overprinting. Government bonds were nearly valueless. The state could barely pay its own employees, let alone maintain armies in the field. The economic chaos that had helped Napoleon seize power would strangle him unless he acted decisively. Napoleon understood finance the way he understood artillery, as a technical problem requiring systematic solutions. He gathered experts and worked with them to rebuild French economic infrastructure from the ground up. In 1800, Napoleon created the Banque de France, establishing a central bank to consolidate financial control and stabilize the currency. This was not merely administrative reform, it was the centralization of financial power in Napoleon's hands. The bank could issue currency, manage government debt, and coordinate the fiscal machinery needed to fund his ambitions. He reformed the tax system entirely, introducing both direct and indirect taxes collected by a modernized professional tax authority. No longer would collection be farmed out to private contractors who skimmed profits. The state would collect its own revenues efficiently. Property taxes, customs duties, taxes on tobacco and salt, all systematized, all feeding into centralized coffers. Napoleon sold state lands to private investors, converting illiquid assets into immediate cash, while creating a new class of property owners with vested interest in the regime's stability. He refinanced the crushing government debt, repaying old loans with new bonds bearing fixed interest rates, controversial but effective in restoring credit. He imposed a fixed exchange rate between the franc and silver, anchoring the currency to precious metal and stopping the inflationary spiral that had destroyed the assignats. These were not revolutionary innovations. They were practical, almost conservative financial measures. But they worked. Public expenditures, which had been chaotic and unaccountable under the Directory, were brought under strict budgetary control. In 1806, the French government spent approximately 700 million francs. By 1811, that had risen to 955 million. By 1812, it reached 1.3 billion francs. In 1813, still 1.15 billion, despite increasing military pressure. Crucially, almost 50% of these expenditures went to defense. Defense spending climbed from 462 million francs in 1807 to 817 million by 1813. Napoleon was building a permanent war economy, one that required constant feeding. The reforms stabilized France's finances, But they also created an apparatus that demanded continuous revenue, which meant continuous conquest. In 1800, Austria remained at war with France. Napoleon crossed the Alps in May, not on a white horse, as the painter David would later depict, but on a mule, the practical choice for mountain passes still deep in spring snow. On June 14th, at Marengo, Napoleon defeated the Austrian army decisively. Austria sued for peace. The Treaty of Lunéville, signed in February 1801, confirmed French control over Belgium and the west bank of the Rhine. More importantly, for Napoleon's purposes, it confirmed French control over northern Italy. The laboratory could be reopened. Napoleon created the Italian Republic in 1802 with himself as president. Then in 1805, he transformed it into the Kingdom of Italy and crowned himself king in Milan. These were not merely political arrangements, they were economic ones. Italy, wealthy and divided, could be taxed systematically to support French military operations elsewhere. The Napoleonic Code, promulgated in 1804, gets remembered as Napoleon's great domestic achievement, the legal framework that rationalized French law and still influences legal systems worldwide. But it also had economic implications. It protected property rights, simplified contracts, and created legal infrastructure for commerce. It made France and French-controlled territories more efficient at generating taxable wealth. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French at Notre Dame. Pope Pius VII attended, though Napoleon famously placed the crown on his own head rather than receiving it from the Pope. The symbolism was clear. Napoleon's authority came from his own power, not from divine sanction. By 1805, Napoleon had accomplished something remarkable. He had taken a bankrupt, chaotic, revolutionary state and transformed it into a disciplined fiscal machine. Tax revenues flowed efficiently. The currency was stable. Government bonds traded at reasonable rates. The Banque de France coordinated lending and money supply. France could borrow, spend, and project power in ways the revolution had made impossible. But the machine had an appetite. The 817 million francs in annual defense spending by 1813 had to come from somewhere. French tax revenues alone could not sustain it indefinitely. The domestic reforms had stabilized the economy, but they had also created expectations of salaries, pensions, public works that required ever more revenue. Napoleon had built a financial engine that could support perpetual war. Now he needed perpetual conquests to feed it. The cycle that had begun in Italy, borrow, conquer, extract, repay, repeat, was now formalized as state policy. The system was elegant, efficient, and ultimately unsustainable. But that realization lay years ahead, beyond battles not yet fought and countries not yet invaded. Chapter 7. The Continental System, October 21st, 1805. Off the coast of Spain near Cape Trafalgar, the combined French and Spanish fleets met the British Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson. By day's end, 19 French and Spanish ships had been captured or destroyed. Nelson himself lay dying from a sniper's bullet, but Britain's naval supremacy was absolute. The French fleet was shattered beyond recovery. For Napoleon, Trafalgar represented a conclusive answer to a question he had been avoiding. France could not invade Britain. The Channel was impassable. British ships controlled it completely, and after Trafalgar, no French admiral would risk challenging them. If Napoleon wanted to defeat Britain, and he desperately did, since Britain bankrolled every coalition against him, he would need a different weapon. He chose economic warfare. On November 21st, 1806, from Berlin, Napoleon issued a decree that would reshape European commerce for the next 8 years. The Berlin Decree established what became known as the Continental System or Continental Blockade. Its terms were sweeping. All trade between Britain and French-controlled Europe was forbidden. Any ship that touched at a British port was banned from French harbors. British goods were to be seized wherever found. European nations under French influence, and by 1806 that meant most of the continent, were required to enforce the blockade or face French military intervention. Napoleon's logic was straightforward. Britain was Europe's manufacturing and commercial center, enriched by the Industrial Revolution. The British economy depended on exports to continental markets. If Napoleon could isolate Britain economically, cutting off its ability to sell goods, he could create inflation, unemployment, and financial crisis in London. Eventually, British economic collapse would force a peace favorable to France. The theory was elegant. The reality proved catastrophic. The continental system suffered from a fundamental flaw. It hurt France's allies and subjects more than it hurt Britain. The Dutch economy, built entirely on trade, collapsed almost immediately. Amsterdam, once Europe's commercial hub, saw its merchant houses close and its ships rot in harbor. Smuggling became the only profitable enterprise. Russia, theoretically an ally after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, found the restrictions unbearable. Russian landowners exported grain, timber, and raw materials, almost exclusively to Britain. The continental system strangled their income. Russian merchants who depended on British manufactured goods faced ruin. By 1810, Tsar Alexander I was openly violating the blockade, allowing neutral ships that had stopped in Britain to trade in Russian ports. Spain's economy, already weakened by misrule and war, suffered terribly. Portuguese merchants, entirely dependent on their historic alliance with Britain, faced destruction. In the Austrian Empire, manufacturers who had competed with British goods briefly prospered from reduced competition, but consumers paid higher prices for inferior products. Only certain regions benefited. The industrialized north and east of France and Wallonia in present-day Belgium saw profits rise significantly from lack of British competition, particularly in textiles, which Britain produced far more cheaply. Some French manufacturers grew wealthy behind the protective wall of the blockade. But these gains were vastly outweighed by the system's costs. Britain responded with its own orders in council, tightening the naval blockade of French ports and requiring neutral ships to obtain British licenses for trade. This created a strange dance of economic warfare, where both sides attempted to strangle commerce while exempting certain goods when expedient. Napoleon periodically opened loopholes. The Trianon Decree of 1810 allowed limited British trade through southwest France and licensed American ships to trade with French ports. These exceptions were admissions of failure. The continental system was hurting France more than Britain. French merchants and manufacturers who depended on overseas markets suffered. Colonial goods, sugar, coffee, tobacco, became scarce and expensive in France while remaining available in Britain. The blockade had failed to reduce British financial support for anti-French coalitions, which was Napoleon's strategic objective. More dangerously, enforcement required military occupation. Napoleon had to maintain armies across Europe simply to prevent smuggling. Coastlines had to be patrolled, borders monitored, warehouses inspected. Every soldier watching a Spanish harbor or German border was a soldier who could not fight in decisive battles. Napoleon recognized the system's fundamental flaw. Widespread violations undermined its effectiveness. As he realized that extensive smuggling was occurring through Spain and Russia, he made the fatal decision to invade both countries to enforce compliance. The Peninsular War, beginning in 1808, became what Napoleon himself later called the Spanish ulcer. French forces occupied Spain to overthrow the Bourbon monarchy and enforce the continental system. But Spanish guerrilla resistance turned the occupation into a bleeding wound that consumed hundreds of thousands of French troops over 6 years. Russia proved even more disastrous. By 1812, Russian violations of the continental system had become systematic. Neutral ships carried British goods through Russian ports openly. Tsar Alexander, facing economic crisis and domestic pressure from his nobility and merchant class, simply ignored Napoleon's demands for enforcement. The continental system, designed to avoid military confrontation with Britain by waging economic war instead, had created the conditions for Napoleon's greatest military catastrophe. The need to enforce the blockade drove him to invade Russia with over 600,000 men in June 1812. The system that was supposed to bring Britain to its knees through economic pressure had instead forced Napoleon into overextension. It had alienated allies, devastated friendly economies, and provided the pretext for invasions that would ultimately destroy the French Empire. In attempting to weaponize trade, Napoleon had discovered the limits of economic coercion. You cannot blockade an island nation when you do not control the seas. You cannot enforce economic compliance across a continent without armies of occupation. And you cannot build a sustainable system on policies that impoverish the very nations you need as allies. By 1812, the continental system existed primarily on paper. In practice, smuggling was ubiquitous, enforcement spotty, and exemptions routine. The grand economic strategy had failed. But admitting failure meant admitting that Britain could not be defeated. Napoleon was not prepared to admit that. Not yet. Chapter 8. The Spanish Ulcer. In October 1807, Napoleon made a decision that seemed, at the time, entirely logical. Portugal maintained its historic alliance with Britain and refused to enforce the continental system. Portuguese ports remained open to British ships, creating a gaping hole in Napoleon's economic blockade. The solution appeared obvious: invade Portugal, depose the pro-British government, and seal the breach. French troops marched through Spain under treaty with the Spanish Bourbon monarchy. But once French armies were positioned throughout the Iberian Peninsula, Napoleon saw a larger opportunity. Spain itself was weak, ruled by the incompetent Charles IV and his despised favorite Manuel de Godoy. The Spanish military was outdated, the government corrupt, the economy mismanaged. Spain also possessed immense wealth in art, church treasures, and colonial silver. Napoleon decided to kill several birds with one stone: enforce the continental system, eliminate a potentially unreliable ally, place his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, and of course extract tribute to fund ongoing wars. In March 1808, Napoleon lured the Spanish royal family to France and forced both Charles IV and his son Ferdinand to abdicate. In June, Joseph Bonaparte was proclaimed King of Spain. It looked initially like another brilliant coup, regime change accomplished with minimal military effort. Then Spain exploded. On May 2, 1808, Madrid rose in revolt against French occupation. French troops suppressed the uprising brutally. The execution of Spanish rebels was immortalized in Francisco Goya's devastating painting, The 3rd of May, 1808. But the Madrid uprising sparked a national insurrection. Across Spain, juntas formed to resist French rule. Peasants, priests, and nobles, who agreed on nothing else, united in hatred of the invader. This was resistance of a kind Napoleon had never encountered. In Italy, in Austria, in Prussia, armies had fought him in conventional battles, lost, and sued for peace. Their governments had signed treaties and paid indemnities. The system worked because power was centralized and defeat was acknowledged. Spain refused to acknowledge defeat. When French armies destroyed Spanish regular forces, guerrilla bands formed in the mountains. When Joseph's government issued decrees, they were ignored. When French troops occupied cities, the countryside remained hostile. Napoleon had stumbled into the first modern guerrilla war, and he had no effective counter to it. Still, the plunder apparatus ground forward with mechanical efficiency. On July 18, 1809, Joseph's government issued a royal decree suppressing all male religious orders in Spain. The ostensible justification was Enlightenment anti-clericalism. The actual purpose was confiscation. All assets of the religious orders, their monasteries, their lands, their artwork, were seized by the state. French officials also confiscated art collections from the aristocracy, using the pretext of creating a great national museum in Madrid, the Museo Josefino, to be established in the Palace of Buena Vista. The museum would mirror the Louvre, they claimed, a repository of human cultural achievement available for public edification. The reality was systematic theft. Frederick Quillier led a commission to requisition paintings, along with Confederates named Maignan, Napoli, and an Englishman, G.A. Wallace. The corruption became so blatant that Quilliet was relieved of his position in 1810, but the confiscations continued. In 1810, Napoleon appointed Vivant Denon, Napoleon's eye, the director of the Louvre, to lead a new commission. Denon personally selected 250 paintings beyond the original planned requisitions, calling them compensation for the military campaign in Spain. From Madrid and its surroundings, over 1,500 paintings were taken. From Seville, approximately 1,000 more. In May 1813, a convoy of about 300 paintings, plus the treasure of the Dolphin, was sent to Paris. But by then, the Spanish campaign was collapsing. Joseph Bonaparte used accumulated artwork as gifts to reward generals serving in the peninsula. D'Armagnac, Caulaincourt, Eblé, Favier, Sebastiani, and Desolles all received paintings. Art dealers followed French troops like carrion birds, buying and selling looted treasures. The economic equation that had worked in Italy failed completely in Spain. The Peninsular War lasted over 6 years, far longer than any other Napoleonic conflict. It witnessed 60 major battles and 30 major sieges. France and her allies lost at least 91,000 killed in action and 237,000 wounded. The financial cost was staggering and continuous. Unlike Italy, where conquered territories quickly became revenue sources, Spain was a constant drain. French armies had to be supplied from France. Guerrilla warfare disrupted French logistics constantly. By October 1811, British intelligence reported that the French army in Spain was in financial trouble, unable to pay any new recruits or tend the wounded. This was the nightmare scenario, a war that consumed resources faster than plunder could replace them. The Spanish ulcer bled France of men, money, and prestige. It tied down 200,000 to 300,000 French troops who could not be deployed elsewhere. It demonstrated to all of Europe that French armies could be resisted, that Napoleon could be fought to a standstill. Napoleon later wrote from exile, "That unfortunate war destroyed me. All the circumstances of my disasters are bound up in that fatal knot." For once, he was not exaggerating. Spain had taught a lesson he refused to learn. Some conquests cost more than any amount of plunder can justify. The system only worked when wars ended quickly, and extraction began immediately. A war that never ended was a war that could never pay for itself. Chapter 9. The Russian Catastrophe. By 1811, Napoleon faced a problem that could not be solved through military genius or administrative reform. Russia was systematically violating the continental system. Russian ports received British goods through neutral ships. Russian merchants traded openly with Britain. Tsar Alexander I, under intense pressure from his nobility and merchant class, was allowing the very trade Napoleon's entire economic strategy depended on preventing. Napoleon issued ultimatums. Alexander made promises he did not keep. Diplomatic relations deteriorated through the winter of 1811-1812. Napoleon convinced himself that Russia's defiance, if left unpunished, would unravel the continental system entirely. Other nations would follow Russia's example. The economic weapon he had forged against Britain would become useless. He decided to invade. The decision was not irrational by Napoleon's logic. Russia was violating treaty obligations. French military superiority was overwhelming. One decisive campaign, 6 weeks, perhaps 8, would bring Alexander to terms, just as campaigns had brought Austria, Prussia, and every other continental power to terms. Then the continental system could be enforced, Britain isolated, and the economic war won. But the scale of operations would be unprecedented. Russia was vast. Its armies could retreat deep into the interior. Supply lines would stretch impossibly long. Napoleon needed an army larger than any he had ever commanded. He assembled the Grande Armée of 1812, over 600,000 men drawn from across the French Empire and its satellites. French, Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, a multinational host representing Napoleon's dominion over Europe. It was the largest army ever assembled under a single command. It was also staggeringly expensive. Arming, equipping, feeding, and transporting 600,000 men required resources on a scale that even Napoleon's reformed fiscal system struggled to provide. Artillery trains, supply wagons, mobile hospitals, portable bridges, the logistical apparatus was enormous. The monthly cost of maintaining such a force exceeded anything France had previously attempted. Napoleon's plan assumed the army would live off Russian territory, just as his armies had lived off Italy, Germany, and Austria. Russia was wealthy in agricultural resources. Its granaries would feed the troops. Its horses would replace French losses. Its cities would provide shelter and supplies. The Grande Armée would sustain itself through foraging, requisition, and, when necessary, plunder. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russia. The invasion had begun. Almost immediately, the plan unraveled. The Russian armies, commanded by Barclay de Tolly and Pyotr Bagration, refused to give battle. They retreated eastward, destroying supplies as they went. Villages were burned before French troops arrived. Crops were torched in the fields. Livestock was driven east or slaughtered. The scorched earth policy was not merely a military tactic. It was economic warfare turned inward. Napoleon's army advanced rapidly, but it advanced into emptiness. Instead of capturing supply depots, they found ashes. Instead of requisitioning food from hostile populations, they found abandoned settlements. The troops began to hunger. Horses died from lack of fodder. Disease spread through the ranks. By July, having advanced barely into Russian territory, the Grande Armée had already lost tens of thousands of men to desertion, disease, and straggling. No major battle had been fought. No tribute had been extracted. The army was consuming itself. In August, Napoleon occupied Smolensk, expecting to find a functioning city with supplies and treasuries. The Russians had burned it. On September 7th at Borodino, 70 miles from Moscow, the Russians finally gave battle. Napoleon won technically. The Russians retreated, but at enormous cost. Over 30,000 French casualties in a single day. The Russian army survived as a fighting force and continued its withdrawal. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow. The ancient capital lay largely abandoned. Fires broke out, possibly set by remaining Russians, possibly accidental, and burned for days. 3/4 of the city was destroyed. There were no supplies. There were no treasuries to plunder. There was nothing to requisition. Napoleon waited in Moscow for 5 weeks, expecting Alexander to negotiate. The logic seemed unassailable. The French had captured Russia's ancient capital. Surely Alexander would sue for peace, agree to enforce the continental system, and allow Napoleon to withdraw victoriously with a treaty signed. Alexander did not negotiate. He did not even respond to Napoleon's letters. By October, snow had begun to fall. Napoleon's position was untenable. His army sat in a burned city without supplies. Russian forces harassed his foragers mercilessly. The supply line back to France stretched over 1,000 miles through hostile territory. On October 19th, Napoleon began the retreat. The retreat from Moscow became one of history's most infamous catastrophes. The Russian winter descended early and brutally. Cossack cavalry harassed the columns constantly. Starvation weakened the troops. Discipline collapsed. Men abandoned comrades to freeze by the roadside. The Grande Armée disintegrated into a mass of desperate survivors. At the Berezina River crossing in late November, French engineers built pontoon bridges under fire while thousands drowned or were killed attempting to cross. The army that emerged from Russia numbered perhaps 100,000 effectives from the original 600,000. Equipment, artillery, treasure, everything had been abandoned in the snow. The financial accounting was devastating. Napoleon had invested the resources of an empire into the largest military operation in history. He had gained nothing, no tribute, no indemnities, no art to ship to Paris, no treasuries to plunder. The entire campaign represented pure expense with zero return. More critically, Russia exposed the fatal flaw in Napoleon's system. The self-financing war machine only functioned if wars ended quickly in decisive victories followed by treaties imposing tribute. A war that dragged on, consuming resources without yielding plunder, broke the entire economic model. On December 5, 1812, Napoleon abandoned what remained of his army and raced back to Paris by sleigh. He needed to suppress news of the disaster, raise new armies, and restore confidence before the vultures circling his empire realized how vulnerable he had become. The numbers, so carefully managed for 16 years, had stopped working, and once they stopped, the entire edifice began to collapse. Chapter 10. The Empire Unravels. Napoleon arrived in Paris on December 18, 1812, having traveled by sleigh across Europe in 13 days. He published the 29th Bulletin, informing France and the world of the catastrophe in Russia, though he carefully minimized the scale of the disaster. The Grande Armée had suffered setbacks, he admitted, primarily from harsh weather. He did not mention that 500,000 men had been lost. What he could not hide was vulnerability. For 16 years, Napoleon's reputation had rested on an image of invincibility. Enemies could be defeated, coalitions dissolved, treaties imposed. Now Prussia, Austria, and the German states saw opportunity. If the great Napoleon could be destroyed in Russia, perhaps he could be destroyed everywhere. Napoleon worked with desperate energy through the winter of 1812-1813, reconstituting his shattered forces. France still had resources, administrative capacity, and Napoleon's organizational genius. Through forced conscription, he raised new armies. By spring 1813, he had assembled approximately 200,000 men. Not the quality of the veterans lost in Russia, but bodies that could hold muskets. The problem was money. France's treasury, carefully managed through years of systematic plunder, was emptying. The Russian campaign had been pure expense. Spain continued bleeding resources with no end in sight. Napoleon needed new tributaries, new sources of wealth to pay for armies, but his former victims were now his enemies. In March 1813, Prussia broke its alliance with France and joined Russia. The War of the Sixth Coalition had begun. In August, Austria abandoned neutrality and joined the alliance against Napoleon. Sweden, now ruled by former French Marshal Bernadotte, who had switched sides, contributed forces. Britain provided the coalition with what Napoleon could no longer provide France: unlimited financial support. The British government, dominant at sea and enriched by global trade, could subsidize Allied armies indefinitely. Napoleon had once used plundered wealth to outlast his enemies financially. Now, the equation had reversed. The coalition could afford a long war. Napoleon could not. Through 1813, Napoleon fought a series of battles in Germany, Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden, winning tactically, but unable to achieve decisive strategic victory. Each battle consumed resources he could not replace. Each victory cost men and materiel without yielding the tributary territories that had previously funded his wars. In October 1813, the coalition armies converged at Leipzig for what became known as the Battle of Nations. For 3 days, October 16th to 19, nearly 500,000 men clashed in the largest battle in European history before the 20th century. Napoleon commanded approximately 190,000 troops. The coalition fielded over 300,000, with Russian, Prussian, Austrian, and Swedish forces all coordinated against him. Napoleon was decisively defeated. His Saxon allies defected mid-battle. The French army retreated across the Elster River, losing thousands when the bridge was prematurely destroyed. The Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon's creation, collapsed. The Kingdom of Westphalia dissolved. German states abandoned French alliance en masse. Napoleon retreated across the Rhine into France. The empire beyond France's borders had evaporated. With it went the financial structure that had sustained French power. No more Italian tribute, no more German indemnities, no more Polish contributions. The extractive system, which had funded 15 years of warfare, suddenly had nothing to extract from. In January 1814, coalition armies invaded France from the east. Wellington's British and Spanish forces invaded from the south, having finally driven French armies from Spain. Napoleon conducted a brilliant defensive campaign in eastern France through February and March, winning a series of battles against numerically superior enemies. But brilliance could not manufacture money. France was exhausted financially and demographically. Napoleon had no reserves, no allies, no prospect of victory. He could win battles, but not the war. On March 31, 1814, Paris surrendered to coalition forces. Marshals Marmont and Mortier, Napoleon's subordinates, negotiated the city's capitulation without his authorization. On April 6th, Napoleon abdicated. He attempted to preserve the dynasty by abdicating in favor of his son, but the coalition rejected this. On April 11th, he abdicated unconditionally. The Treaty of Fontainebleau exiled him to Elba, a small Mediterranean island, and granted him an annual pension of 2 million francs from the restored Bourbon monarchy. Louis XVI became King of France. The borders returned to their 1792 limits. The First French Empire ceased to exist. Napoleon departed for Elba on April 20th, 1814. He was 44 years old. The system that had elevated him from Corsican poverty to master of Europe had consumed itself. War had paid for war until it couldn't anymore. The extractive empire had exhausted its sources. The numbers, so carefully managed for so long, had finally, definitively, failed to balance. Chapter 11. The 100 Days' Gamble. Elba was a prison disguised as a principality. Napoleon ruled an island of 12,000 inhabitants, commanded a guard of 400 soldiers, and received reports from a minister whose domain extended 11 miles at its widest point. The Treaty of Fontainebleau had granted him sovereignty over this Mediterranean speck and promised him an annual pension of 2 million francs from the restored French government. The pension never arrived. Louis XVIII's government, aware that paying Napoleon strengthened a potential rival, simply ignored its treaty obligations. By early 1815, Napoleon's financial situation on Elba was becoming desperate. He could not pay his guards properly. His small court operated on credit. The indignity was profound for a man who had once commanded the treasuries of Europe. But Napoleon had sources of information beyond Elba. Letters arrived secretly from France describing chaos under the restored Bourbon monarchy. Louis XVIII had abolished conscription, angering the army. He had restored émigré nobles to positions of power, alienating revolutionaries. He had adopted the white Bourbon flag, outraging those who had fought under the tricolor. France was bitter, divided, and increasingly nostalgic for the certainty Napoleon had provided, if not the wars. The Congress of Vienna, where European powers were redrawing the map of Europe, was reportedly deadlocked over Poland and Saxony. Austria and Britain opposed Prussian and Russian territorial demands. There were rumors of potential conflict among the victors. If Napoleon moved quickly, perhaps the coalition would not reunite against him. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba with approximately 1,000 men aboard 7 small vessels. The British warship supposed to monitor him was away in Italian waters. On March 1st, he landed near Cannes on the French coast. What followed was extraordinary. Louis XVIII sent the 5th Regiment of the Line to arrest Napoleon at Grenoble. When the regiment encountered Napoleon on March 7th, he walked toward them alone, opened his coat, and declared, "Soldiers of the 5th, if there is any man among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The regiment defected to him on the spot. Marshal Ney, who had sworn to Louis XVIII that he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, joined Napoleon instead on March 14th. Other marshals and generals followed. Louis XVIII's support evaporated. On March 19th, Louis fled Paris for Belgium. On March 20th, Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace in triumph, carried there by crowds without firing a shot. The 100 Days had begun. Napoleon was emperor again. But he was emperor of a bankrupt nation about to be invaded by overwhelming force. On March 13th, even before Napoleon reached Paris, the Congress of Vienna had declared him an outlaw. Within days, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia mobilized armies to destroy him. The 7th Coalition was forming, and this time it would not stop until Napoleon was permanently removed from power. Napoleon faced an impossible financial situation. France's treasury was empty. Louis XVIII had abolished conscription, so Napoleon could not immediately draw on the mass of trained veterans who had returned to civilian life during the Restoration. He needed to raise, equip, and field an army large enough to defeat multiple coalition forces, and he needed to do it in weeks, not months. He moved with the frantic energy of a man who understood the arithmetic of his situation. All undischarged soldiers were summoned to arms. In 8 weeks, approximately 80,000 men were added to the existing garrison forces. The conscription class of 1815 was called up, too late to participate in the coming campaign, but Napoleon hoped to field 500,000 men by autumn if he could survive until then. From a paper strength of 224,000 men in March, Napoleon increased the army to 662,331 by June, a massive expansion accomplished in 3 months. But expansion required money for weapons, uniforms, equipment, horses, artillery, supplies. Napoleon resorted to emergency borrowing on a scale unprecedented even for him. The problem was credibility. Who would lend to a regime that might not exist in 6 months? Napoleon offered bonds backed by future tax revenues, but French bankers remembered the fate of previous government debt. He seized gold reserves where he could find them. He imposed emergency taxes. He mortgaged everything against a future he might not have. By mid-June, Napoleon had approximately 125,000 troops concentrated near the Belgian border. Coalition forces were assembling, but not yet fully concentrated. A Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher, approximately 120,000 strong, was positioned in Belgium. An Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington, approximately 95,000 strong, was also in Belgium. Russian and Austrian armies were still marching west and would not arrive for weeks. Napoleon's strategy was classically Napoleonic: strike before the enemy could concentrate, defeat the Prussians and British separately before the Russians and Austrians arrived, force a quick peace on favorable terms, restore French prestige, resume the system of extracting tribute from defeated enemies. On June 15th, Napoleon crossed into Belgium. On June 16th, he defeated Blücher at Ligny, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing the Prussians to retreat. Napoleon detached Marshal Grouchy with 33,000 men to pursue the Prussians, roughly 1/3 of his total force, while he turned to deal with Wellington. On June 18th, near the village of Waterloo, Napoleon faced Wellington's army positioned on a ridge. Rain had fallen through the night, soaking the ground. Napoleon delayed his attack until mid-morning, waiting for the ground to dry enough for artillery to be effective. The delay would prove fatal. The battle raged through the afternoon. Napoleon's forces attacked Wellington's positions repeatedly, but could not break the British squares. Wellington's line held, bent, but did not break. Then, late in the afternoon, Prussian forces began arriving on Napoleon's right flank. Blücher had evaded Grouchy's pursuit and was reinforcing Wellington with fresh troops. By 7 p.m., Napoleon's army was fighting on 2 fronts. Wellington launched a general advance. The Prussians attacked from the east. The French army broke. What had been an organized fighting force dissolved into panic and retreat. Napoleon's Imperial Guard, his elite reserve, was committed too late and overwhelmed. By nightfall, the French army was in flight. Napoleon abandoned the battlefield and raced back toward Paris. Behind him lay 25,000 French casualties and 9,000 captured. The Grande Armée, reformed at such cost over 3 desperate months, had been destroyed in a single afternoon. On June 22nd, 4 days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. This time, there would be no Elba, no pension, no sovereignty over anything. On July 15th, he surrendered to the British at Rochefort, hoping they would grant him asylum in England. The gamble had failed. The financial desperation that drove the escape from Elba, the frantic army raising, the enormous borrowing, the bet that one quick campaign could restore everything, all of it had collapsed on a muddy ridge in Belgium. This time, Napoleon had no treasure to take into exile, no gold to pay followers, no art to barter. The system had extracted its last franc and spent it. The war that was supposed to pay for itself had consumed everything and yielded nothing. The machine had finally stopped. Chapter 12, St. Helena's Ledger. On July 15, 1815, Napoleon surrendered to Captain Frederick Maitland aboard HMS Bellerophon off the coast of Rochefort. He had considered fleeing to America, perhaps buying a farm, living quietly under an assumed name, fading into obscurity in the New World. But British ships blockaded the French coast completely. Escape was impossible. Napoleon convinced himself the British would treat him as a distinguished exile, perhaps allowing him to retire to some English country estate. He imagined himself a gentleman farmer, writing his memoirs, perhaps advising on military matters. He told Maitland he was placing himself under the protection of British law, like Themistocles, seating myself at the hearth of the British people. The British government had other plans. On July 31st, while Bellerophon lay anchored off Plymouth, Napoleon learned his fate. He would be sent to St. Helena, a volcanic island in the South Atlantic, 200 miles from the nearest mainland. He would remain there under guard until death. Napoleon protested violently. This was not asylum, it was imprisonment. He had surrendered expecting protection under British law, not deportation to the most isolated place on earth. His protests were ignored. On August 7th, he was transferred to HMS Northumberland. The voyage to St. Helena took 2 months and 1 week. 20 people accompanied Napoleon into this final exile. General Henri Bertrand, his Grand Marshal, with Bertrand's wife Fanny and their children. General Charles de Montholon, with his wife Albine and their son. General Gaspard Gourgaud, Emmanuel de las Casas and his son, Napoleon's valet Marchand, his Mameluke servant Ali, and several other servants. A small court for a fallen emperor. St. Helena appeared on the horizon on October 15th, 1815, a forbidding silhouette of black volcanic cliffs rising 200 to 300 meters directly from the ocean. The island measured roughly 10 by 5 miles, home to perhaps 5,000 inhabitants, accessible at only 3 points. Its isolation made it the perfect prison. Escape was impossible. Rescue was impossible. The world's most dangerous man would spend his remaining days on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic. Initially, Napoleon stayed at the Briars, a pavilion owned by the Balcombe family. For 2 months he enjoyed something approximating comfort, pleasant accommodations, friendly hosts, relative freedom of movement. Then, on December 10, 1815, he was moved to Longwood House, his permanent residence. Longwood was a former farmhouse, hastily expanded to accommodate the imperial prisoner. It sat on a wind-swept plateau, constantly shrouded in fog and humidity. The climate alternated unpredictably between heavy rain and scorching sun. The buildings were damp, moldy, poorly ventilated. Napoleon's servants complained constantly of colds, respiratory ailments, damp floors. The place was slowly poisonous. The new governor of St. Helena, Sir Hudson Lowe, arrived in April 1816. From their first meeting, Napoleon and Lowe detested each other. Lowe, following British government instructions, refused to address Napoleon as Emperor or even General Bonaparte. He insisted on Napoleon Bonaparte, or simply General. Napoleon's weapons were confiscated. His correspondence was opened and read. He was restricted to walking within a limited area under British military supervision. The humiliations were systematic and deliberate. The British government wanted to ensure Napoleon could never again disturb the peace of the world. Lowe wanted to ensure he could never escape as he had from Elba. The result was a regime of petty restrictions and constant surveillance that ground away at Napoleon's pride and health. Napoleon's days at Longwood fell into monotonous routine. Mornings were spent dictating memoirs to his companions, rewriting history, shaping his legend, crafting the narrative that would survive him. In his version, he had been forced to extract tribute to feed his troops when France's government failed to support them. In his version, the Directory had demanded the wealth from conquered territories. In his version, he had brought civilization, legal reform, and enlightenment, not conquest and plunder. Afternoons meant limited exercise, horseback riding within the restricted area, though Napoleon rode less as time passed and his health declined. Evenings featured chess, cards, piano music from Albin de Montholon, readings from his extensive library. He had brought 600 books to St. Helena. Through donations and purchases, the library eventually exceeded 3,000 volumes. But the isolation weighed heavily. Over the years, members of his entourage left. General Gourgaud departed in 1818, unable to endure the boredom and infighting among Napoleon's small court. Madame de Montholon left in 1819. Las Casas had been deported by Lowe in 1816 for attempting to smuggle uncensored letters. The circle grew smaller, tighter, more desperate. Napoleon shut himself away increasingly in his rooms. He refused visits from British officers. He obsessed over news of his son, the King of Rome, now held in Austria, being raised as an Austrian archduke and forbidden any contact with his father. Napoleon would never see him again. His health began failing noticeably by 1819. Abdominal pain, constipation, vomiting, overall weakness. He was 50 years old, but aging rapidly in the damp, moldy atmosphere of Longwood. By February 1821, he knew death was approaching. Napoleon reconciled with the Catholic Church after years of tumultuous relations that had included excommunicating the Pope and kidnapping him to France. He made his confession and took the final sacraments. He dictated his will, a complex document with 3 parts, a political testament with famous phrases claiming he died murdered by the English oligarchy and its hireling, a personal will allocating 7 million francs to relatives and companions, and an accounting claiming he had saved 204 million francs from his civil list, meant to be distributed to soldiers of the Grande Armée. The French government would later refuse this distribution, leading to decades of lawsuits. On May 5, 1821, at approximately 5:49 in the evening, Napoleon died. He was 51 years old. The official autopsy, performed the next day by his physician, Francesco Antomarchi, listed the cause as stomach cancer, possibly the same disease that had killed his father. His heart and intestines were removed and sealed in vessels, standard treatment for monarchs' bodies. He was buried on St. Helena in the Valley of the Willows, a spot he had particularly enjoyed during his brief periods of freedom on the island. The man who had extracted hundreds of millions in tribute died on British government charity, his debts exceeding his assets, his treasury empty. Chapter 13. The Louvre's Memory. In the spring of 1815, as Napoleon marched toward Waterloo, Allied representatives in Vienna were already planning what would happen to the treasures he had systematically extracted from across Europe. The question was delicate. Hundreds of masterpieces sat in the Louvre and other French museums, paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, antiquities taken from Italy, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Spain, and Egypt over 2 decades of conquest. France claimed these works had been legitimately transferred through formal treaties. The Armistice of Bologna, the Treaty of Tolentino, the Treaty of Campo Formio, all contained explicit clauses requiring the surrender of specified artworks. From France's perspective, these were legal transactions, not theft. The conquered nations had agreed, however reluctantly, to the terms. The conquered nations saw it differently. Treaties signed with French armies occupying your capital and French artillery pointed at your palace were not freely negotiated agreements. They were extortion formalized on paper. The art had been stolen at gunpoint. The paperwork simply disguised the crime. After Waterloo, the Allied coalition possessed both the moral authority and military power to demand restitution. The Second Treaty of Paris, signed in November 1815, included provisions for the return of artworks taken during the Napoleonic Wars. Allied commissioners arrived in Paris to supervise the repatriation. The French resisted furiously. Museum officials argued that moving the works risked damaging them, that they had been better cared for in Paris than in their original locations, that France had invested enormous sums in preservation and display, that the works now constituted French cultural patrimony and belonged to the French people, not to foreign monarchs. The arguments were rejected. Through the fall and winter of 1815-1816, Allied troops escorted convoys of returning treasures. The 4 bronze horses of St. Mark's Cathedral returned to Venice in triumph, installed once again on the basilica where they had stood for centuries before Napoleon took them. Pope Pius VII recovered the Apollo Belvedere, the Laocoon, and Raphael's Transfiguration from the Vatican collections. Austria reclaimed works taken from Vienna. Prussia recovered pieces from Berlin and Potsdam. The Netherlands demanded return of Flemish masters. Spanish representatives sought paintings plundered during the Peninsular War, though many had been scattered among French generals and dealers, making recovery difficult. But the repatriation was far from complete. French officials employed every bureaucratic obstacle imaginable. They claimed certain works could not be moved safely. They argued that some pieces had been purchased legitimately on the open market, not seized under treaties. They pointed out that transport costs would be enormous and might damage fragile works. They simply hid some pieces, moving them to provincial museums or private collections where Allied commissioners could not find them. The result was that scores of works never returned. Some remained in the Louvre because tracking them proved impossible. Others stayed because Allied governments lacked resources to transport them or decided the diplomatic cost of insisting outweighed the value of the artwork. Still others remained because France simply refused, and the Allies, exhausted by 23 years of war, chose not to press the issue. The Louvre, built on Napoleon's systematic plunder, retained a significant portion of its ill-gotten collection. Over the following decades, some additional works were quietly repatriated through diplomatic channels. Others were purchased by their original owners from French private collections where they had migrated. Many simply remained in France, their origins gradually forgotten or obscured. The precedent Napoleon established, art as legitimate spoils of war, plunder systematized as state policy, museums built on conquest, influenced European colonialism for the next century. The British Museum's Egyptian collections, acquired after the French defeat in Egypt, the treasures of the Benin bronzes taken by British forces in 1897, countless artifacts extracted from colonized territories and displayed in European capitals as symbols of imperial power. Napoleon did not invent cultural plunder, but he industrialized it. He created bureaucratic apparatus for systematic theft, trained experts to select the most valuable pieces, and formalized extraction through treaties that gave theft the appearance of legality. The debates he triggered continue today. Should the Parthenon marbles return to Greece from the British Museum? Should African artifacts return from European collections? Should museums acknowledge how much of their holdings were acquired through coercion, conquest, or theft? In Vienna, the Mona Lisa theft of 1911 was justified by the Italian thief Vincenzo Peruggia as returning the painting to Italy, though Leonardo's masterpiece had actually been purchased legitimately, not stolen by Napoleon. Egypt still requests return of the Rosetta Stone from Britain, discovered by French soldiers in 1799, but captured by British forces in 1801. The Louvre stands today as one of the world's great museums, visited by millions annually. Its collections span civilizations and centuries. Much of it was assembled legitimately through purchases, donations, and archaeological expeditions. But walk through its Italian galleries, its ancient sculpture halls, its Egyptian wing, and you walk through Napoleon's legacy, the museum as monument to systematic plunder. Chapter 14. The Balance Sheet of Blood. The Napoleonic Wars, spanning from 1803 to 1815, claimed an estimated 3 to 6 million lives. The range exists because counting the dead in early 19th century warfare was imprecise at best. Soldiers died in battles, yes, but also from disease, starvation, exposure, and infected wounds in field hospitals. Civilians died from starvation when armies requisitioned their food, from disease spread by troop movements, from executions and reprisals. France alone suffered at least 500,000 military deaths, possibly far more. The Russian campaign of 1812 killed perhaps 400,000 to 500,000 French and Allied soldiers. The Peninsular War consumed another 91,000 French killed and 237,000 wounded over 6 grinding years. Battles like Leipzig, Borodino, and Waterloo each claimed tens of thousands in single days. The human cost extended beyond battlefield casualties. Hundreds of thousands returned home maimed, blinded, or psychologically shattered. Families lost fathers, sons, brothers. Entire generations of young men disappeared into Napoleon's armies. Villages across Europe were depopulated. Agricultural production collapsed in regions repeatedly crossed by marching armies. The economic devastation was similarly incalculable. Infrastructure throughout Europe lay in ruins. Roads destroyed by artillery and supply wagons, bridges blown up during retreats, cities burned during sieges, fields left untilled while their farmers died in Russia or Spain. How much wealth did Napoleon extract through his system? Perhaps 1 billion francs in total tribute, indemnities, and plundered treasure, though accurate accounting is impossible. Art treasures worth millions more. Resources requisitioned directly from occupied territories that never appeared in any ledger. Against this, calculate the cost. France's military expenditures during the Napoleonic Wars totaled approximately 5 billion francs, about 13% of France's GDP during that period. Add the economic damage from lost trade, destroyed infrastructure, and depleted population. Add the costs borne by other nations, Britain's subsidies to coalition partners, Russia's losses, Austria's repeated defeats and indemnities. The arithmetic is brutal. Napoleon's system of making war pay for itself through systematic extraction was a catastrophic failure in aggregate terms. Yes, individual campaigns in Italy or Germany generated positive returns measured narrowly. But the overall balance sheet showed massive losses. France emerged from the wars weaker than it had entered them, population depleted, economy exhausted, international position diminished. Borders returned to roughly where they had been in 1792. The French colonial empire was lost to British naval power. A generation of young men was dead or broken. Britain, conversely, emerged as the dominant global power. British naval supremacy was unchallenged. British industry had grown during the wars. British colonial possessions had expanded. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. London, not Paris, would dominate the 19th century. The extractive system Napoleon built consumed more wealth than it created. It destroyed productive capacity faster than plunder could replace it. It generated resistance that made occupation increasingly expensive. It required continuous expansion, and when expansion stopped, the entire structure collapsed. Perhaps Napoleon's greatest failure was believing that wealth could be built on theft. that taking from conquered peoples could create sustainable prosperity, that military genius could overcome economic fundamentals. The ledger of blood proved otherwise. You cannot build lasting empire on plunder. You cannot create prosperity through extraction. You cannot sustain power by impoverishing those you rule. Chapter 15. Legacy and Lessons. Napoleon Bonaparte died on a remote Atlantic island in 1821, but the question of what he left behind remains contested 2 centuries later. His reforms transformed France and influenced Europe for generations. His military campaigns redrew maps and toppled dynasties. His systematic extraction of wealth from conquered territories created precedents that echoed through the colonial era and beyond. What endured from Napoleon's domestic reforms? The Napoleonic Code, promulgated in 1804, remains the foundation of civil law in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of Germany, Italy, and dozens of former French colonies. Its principles, equality before the law, protection of property rights, secular marriage, abolition of privileges based on birth, outlasted the empire that created them. The Code made law rational, accessible, and uniform in ways feudal systems never had. The metric system, standardized under Napoleon, became the global standard for measurement. The Légion d'honneur, created to reward merit rather than birth, still honors French citizens today. Educational reforms establishing lycées and grandes écoles created institutional frameworks that persist. The Banque de France, founded in 1800, continues as France's central bank. These were genuine achievements. They improved lives. They rationalized administration. They established principles of merit over aristocratic privilege. History rightly credits Napoleon with these contributions. What did not endure? The empire, the Grande Armée, the continental system, the territories conquered, the treasures extracted, the system of self-financing war through systematic plunder. All of it vanished within months of Waterloo. Napoleon's most dubious legacy was systematizing what previous conquerors had done informally. Looting after military victory was ancient practice. Victorious armies had always taken spoils. But Napoleon created bureaucratic apparatus for state-sponsored extraction. He trained experts to catalog treasures. He formalized theft through treaty clauses. He transformed random plunder into industrial-scale cultural appropriation. This systematization influenced later European colonial extraction. The British Empire's removal of artifacts from colonized territories, the French colonial administration's resource extraction from Africa and Southeast Asia, the systematic looting of China during the Opium Wars, all followed patterns Napoleon had normalized. Plunder became policy. Theft became administration. Taking cultural treasures became preserving civilization. Napoleon also pioneered total war economics, the complete mobilization of a nation's resources for military purposes. The Directory and Consulate built fiscal machinery that could conscript men, tax commerce, borrow against future victories, and coordinate industrial production for military ends. This model influenced both sides during World War I and reached its fullest expression in World War II, when entire economies were reorganized around military production. The fundamental flaw in Napoleon's system was that extractive economies eventually exhaust themselves. You can loot a country once, perhaps twice, if you're efficient about it. But continuous extraction requires continuous expansion into new territories with fresh wealth to take. This means continuous conquest, which requires continuous military victory. One major defeat breaks the system. Russia proved it. When Napoleon invaded with 600,000 men and returned with 100,000, having extracted nothing and lost everything, the entire financial apparatus collapsed. The machine required perpetual motion. When it stopped, it could not restart. Spain had already demonstrated the problem from a different angle. A conquest that never ends, that generates continuous resistance requiring perpetual occupation, costs more than any amount of plunder can offset. The Peninsular War consumed 330,000 French casualties over 6 years, while yielding relatively little extractable wealth. Some conquests cost more than their worth, no matter how systematically you loot them. Napoleon never answered the central question his system raised. What happens after you've conquered everything? If war must pay for war through extracting wealth from defeated enemies, and if this requires continuous expansion into new territories, eventually you run out of places to conquer. Then what? The implicit answer was that expansion must continue forever, which is obviously impossible. The practical answer was that the system would collapse the moment expansion stopped, which is exactly what happened. Modern parallels exist. Economies built primarily on extracting resources from weaker regions, whether through colonialism, debt arrangements, or military occupation, follow Napoleon's pattern. They appear successful while expansion continues. They generate wealth for the extracting power while impoverishing the extracted regions. They create resentment that eventually generates resistance, and they fail catastrophically when expansion stops or resistance becomes too costly. The 20th century's decolonization movements demonstrated that extracted peoples eventually expel their extractors. The cost of maintaining control exceeds the value of resources taken. Military occupation becomes economically unsustainable. The system collapses, usually rapidly, once the tipping point is reached. Napoleon's experiment proved that military genius cannot overcome economic fundamentals. Brilliant tactics, revolutionary strategy, organizational genius, none of it mattered once the basic arithmetic failed. You cannot build lasting prosperity on theft. You cannot create sustainable power through extraction. You cannot maintain an empire by impoverishing those you rule. Perhaps the deepest lesson is simpler, that wealth must be created, not merely taken. That sustainable prosperity requires productive capacity, not just efficient plunder. That systems built on taking from others eventually destroy themselves. 2 centuries after Waterloo, Napoleon's military campaigns remain studied in war colleges. His civil code influences legal systems worldwide. His administrative reforms shaped modern governance. These are legitimate contributions to human development. But his economic system, war as self-financing extraction, conquest as revenue source, systematic plunder as state policy, stands as a cautionary tale. It appeared to work brilliantly for a time. It funded an empire and filled museums. It made Napoleon master of Europe. And then it collapsed completely, leaving millions dead and Europe in ruins, proving that you cannot build anything lasting on the systematic theft from others, no matter how brilliantly organized. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, to minor Corsican nobility on an island that had been French for barely a year. He died on May 5, 1821, on another island, this one chosen specifically for its isolation, thousands of miles from anywhere that mattered. Between those 2 islands lay 51 years that changed Europe forever. The boy who left Corsica at age 10 carried with him the hunger of poverty and the sting of being an outsider. He watched his father adapt to French rule out of necessity. He learned that survival required pragmatism, that power belonged to those bold enough to seize it, that yesterday's principles could become today's obstacles. Military school taught him mathematics and tactics. The revolution gave him opportunity. Italy taught him the crucial lesson that would define his career. Armies need not drain national treasuries. They could fill them. If you moved fast enough, struck hard enough, and extracted systematically enough, war could pay for itself. For nearly 20 years, the system worked. Napoleon sent millions in gold and silver from conquered Italian cities to Paris. He stripped palaces of their art and filled the Louvre with masterpieces taken at gunpoint. He imposed indemnities on defeated nations that funded his next campaigns. He built an empire that sustained itself by extracting wealth from those it conquered. The innovation was not plunder itself. Victorious armies had always taken spoils. Napoleon's contribution was systematizing extraction, creating bureaucratic machinery that could identify valuable art, negotiate tribute clauses into treaties, and convert military victory into fiscal revenue with mechanical efficiency. He transformed random looting into state policy. This system elevated him from provincial artillery officer to Emperor of the French. It funded the Grande Armée. It built roads, bridges, legal codes. It turned France from revolutionary chaos into the dominant continental power. The Code Napoleon still shapes legal systems worldwide. The metric system became global standard. Administrative reforms modernized governance across Europe. But the system carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Extraction requires victims with wealth to extract. Continuous extraction requires continuous expansion into fresh territories. Continuous expansion requires continuous military victory. One major defeat breaks the cycle. Russia broke it. The 600,000 men who marched east in 1812, expecting to extract tribute as they had in Italy and Germany, instead found scorched earth and endless retreat. They extracted nothing. They lost everything. The machine that had run for 16 years suddenly stopped. Spain had already shown the flaw from another angle. A war that never ends, that generates perpetual resistance, costs more than any plunder can offset. 6 years, 330,000 casualties, millions in expenses. And Spain never became the tributary Napoleon needed. When expansion stopped, when defeats mounted, when tributaries became enemies rather than victims, the financial arithmetic collapsed. France emerged from the Napoleonic Wars weaker than it entered them. Population depleted, economy exhausted. Borders returned to 1792 levels. The empire vanished. The plunder stopped. What remained? Museums filled with stolen art, though much was returned after 1815. Legal codes and administrative structures, roads and public works, memories of glory and trauma. 3 to 6 million dead across Europe. Countless more wounded, displaced, broken. And Napoleon himself, dying alone at Longwood House, dictating memoirs that rewrote history in his favor. In his version, he had been forced to extract tribute when France's government failed to support him. In his version, he brought civilization and enlightenment, not conquest and extraction. In his version, he was the victim of British oligarchy and continental jealousy. The numbers tell a different story. 5 billion francs spent on wars, perhaps 1 billion extracted in tribute, millions of lives consumed, an empire built and lost, a system that appeared brilliant until it collapsed completely. Napoleon's ghost still walks the corridors of the Louvre, still rides the Arc de Triomphe, still whispers from kilometer markers and code books across Europe. His military genius is studied. His administrative innovations are acknowledged. His conquests are mapped and analyzed. But his economic system, the self-financing war machine, the systematic extraction, the empire built on plunder, stands as proof that some victories are really defeats in slow motion. That you cannot build lasting wealth by taking from others. that military brilliance cannot overcome fundamental economic impossibility, that systems requiring perpetual expansion must eventually collapse. Was he great conqueror or efficient thief? Visionary reformer or systematic pillager? Military genius or economic incompetent? Perhaps all of these, perhaps none purely. What's certain is this: he proved that even the most brilliant financial system fails when built on others' suffering. That extraction is not creation. That taking is not building. That you cannot sustain empire by impoverishing those you rule. The treasure he extracted is scattered or returned. The empire is dust. The armies are gone. What endures are the reforms he made when he stopped taking and started building, and the lesson that he could have built so much more if he had never confused the two. Sweet dreams, friends, and remember, all the gold in the world cannot buy what Napoleon lost: his freedom, his empire, his place in history as anything more than a cautionary tale about the true cost of ambition built on theft. Sweet dreams, and we'll meet again soon for another story.